Ladies and gentlemen, that was bad, but ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the very first episode of Headcannon. Yay! Let us begin. Gee. Thank you. Okay. Now, for the first series that we'll do on this channel, it's going to be the history of this fictional country here. It's called Dreisland. Now, of course, this is episode 1, therefore it'll be the introduction. So what exactly is this fictional country that some of you have absolutely no idea about, some of you probably have some idea. Probably because I actually wrote this. Anyway, it is fan-made, I made it, and it's for an anime called Gate. I'm just going to say Gate because the title is too long, and I'm trying to say this mostly in English, so when I go into Japanese I tend to mispronounce stuff. I'm sorry. But basically this is a show about 21st century Japan gets invaded by a fantasy world army. The fantasy world gets defeated, Japan gets pissed, Japan quote-unquote invades. Technically they don't because the JSDF can't invade other countries. And the story basically goes from there. Dreisland itself is, like in my head, a mashup of these countries. Mainly Germany, some bit of Poland, so USSR. There's a tiny bit of Indonesia. It's not really apparent, although it's only apparent on this particular slideshow. Now, within the story, this country is used to be part of the Empire, which is the bad guys from the TV show. Now, there used to be their colonies, and then War of Independence, the unification, and then this country came to be. It's mostly Germanic. I say Germanic because I don't know if there's an equivalent to that in the particular story. But regardless, here are some of the common languages. Dreislandic, the Imperial Standard, which is probably something close to Latin. Considering what I've heard in the actual show, it's most likely something along the lines of Latin. If I'm actually going to have the Imperials speak in their native language, it's probably going to be in Latin. Probably won't, because I'm writing the entire story in English. We also have some Japanese. They're an immigrant population. If you've actually read the story, you would understand why the hell the Japanese are here. It's a time-space continuum thing. It's really complicated, but these are Imperial Japanese. Now, population graph here, this is the colonials that were born in the colonies. This is the immigrants from the Empire that were not born in the colonies, but have been residing in the colonies for some time. These are the Japanese, and here's the others, basically American, Soviet, German. I think that's it. I think that's all the factions that I brought in, yes. Now, they have a heavy military influence from those immigrant countries. Now, of course, they have their own native military, which mainly focuses on high-speed, light cavalry, even though that's technically dragoons in modern terms, because the infantry dismounts with repeating crossbows and harass the enemy from concealed positions. That's basically dragoons. And then we also have the heavy infantry, which basically work like tanks, which is why they're called panzers. Then we have the Imperial Japanese, because the Imperial Japanese are the biggest faction to immigrate into Dreisland, aside from the Imperials. The entirety of the Navy is based on the Imperial Japanese. There's a lot of technological transfer. This is most of it. The organization of various military units is also Japanese. And the ranking system is also Japanese, although it's just the Navy, which means that in the Army you would end up having a Army ensign, while in the Navy you have a Navy ensign, and then in the Air Force you have a Air Force ensign, and it's surprisingly simple, but it doesn't really occur to much people. Also, this is the Navy Jack. As you can tell, it's really Imperial Japanese influenced. Next we have the Americans. Their main contribution comes in the Marines and the Airborne, because the Japanese and German methods of paratrooping weren't really effective. See Crete. Like, you drop your equipment, and then you drop your troops. Now your troops have to go find the equipment, which most likely is captured by the enemy. That is never good. Again, Germany, because Germanic population. The armor doctrine, basically just panzer divisions and all. The Luftwaffe, they basically just take the entire name of the Luftwaffe. As well as a lot of technology, i.e. radar, ballistic missiles, Sturmgewehrs, assault rifles, basically, U-boats, jet-propelled stuff, like just jets, although the Kika is Japanese, and there's a lot of Kikas in Dreislandic use, and they're technically Japanese, and they're jets. So yeah, there's that. And then we have some Soviet influence. Other than communism, which is not listed here because that's not really a military influence, they mostly influenced artillery doctrine. Probably because a lot of Dreislandic soldiers were not really the best educated, sorry about that. So, same with the Soviet artillerymen, so Soviet artillery doctrine kind of works. It's for a less educated populace, so yeah. This is the slide that I accidentally clicked on, but this is a war record from 0680, which is one of the dates here, to the quote-unquote present day, assuming we actually get this far in this series. 0680 is, in this particular headcanon, is referred to as the First War of Acceptance, which is basically a massive rebellion in the colonies that gets crushed really badly. It's also mentioned in the Gate Wiki. If you actually go on there and click on the tab for the Empire, you'll actually find this war. It's not really labeled as the First War of Acceptance, because it isn't. It is, however, labeled as a massive rebellion that happened in 0680. Probably why they had all those troops mobilized in the first place anyway. I don't think you can mobilize that much troops in a span of 7 years. Now we have 0685, this is when those World War II factions enter, and they're like, hey, these people are nice to us. They're referring to the colonials, by the way. Hey, these people are nice to us. Let's give them technology and shit so they can declare independence and such. That's the second war. And then we have 0687 to 0688. These are the Unification Wars. 0687 also happens to be the year that the Continental Empire, which is where I'm going to refer to the antagonist empire from now on, invades Japan and gets their asses kicked. That's this year. I'm quite sure that entire war actually spanned, like, a few months, which is kind of sad. Like, the actual war. And then there's all the other political stuff, but that's in the show, and I'm not really going to delve into that. But anyway, we have the Unification Wars for Dreisland, because originally it's 3 colonies, one in the west, one in the east, one in the north, and then South Dreisland's occupied by another empire. Again, Wars of Independence is the first 3 imperial colonies, and then the South Dreisland's invaded and then occupied. I'm doing weird motions with my mouse. Whee. And then, 10-year time skip, 0698. This is the Continental Liberation War. For the rest of the world, it's referred to as the Great War. For America, China, Russia, and Japan, it's referred to as why the hell are we fighting such an expensive war in a place that doesn't really affect us anyway. Yeah. Probably why they lost. Spoilers. Next we have 2 wars that pretty much go on simultaneously, one shorter than the other. We have the Bundesian Civil War. This is another country that I have created for this universe. Same with this one. Philadelphia is another one. But I will do specials on them later. Just know that this is a confederation of a whole bunch of the allied kingdoms that we get to see in episode 2 of the anime. This is completely original. This is the empire that holds basically a subcontinent southwest of Dreisland, and they also occupied South Dreisland until Dreisland invaded South Dreisland and occupied it and annexed it. Yes. And then from February to December of 0709, Dreisland and Japan end up having some border conflicts on the continent. From 0718 to 0720, the same thing happens with Russia, except this gets a little nuclear after a while. Russia, why do you keep bringing nukes into random stuff? And then 0720, the Chinese and Americans get caught up in a border conflict with Dreisland as well. No shots are fired officially. Though shots are fired, none of them are actually official, like we can start a war now kind of thing. Now, let us begin with Dreisland's military. Yes, this is going to be during the Continental Liberation War, because before that, most of this stuff hasn't even existed anyway. Now, let's begin. First we have the army. The Federation Armee du Dreisland, which is, by the way, Dreislandic. This is not French, this is not German, this is not Russian, it's Dreislandic. Okay? Good. Now, this translates to Federal Army of Dreisland, and originally it is known as the Federal Revolutionary Army. This is also what it is referred to in the story so far. Dreisland's military is referred to as the Federal Revolutionary Military in the most recent chapter of my story. Their official march is Preußen's Gloria, which, probably because of their German influence, they kind of liked after the German faction introduced this particular song, and they're like, hey, this sounds awesome. Let's use it. That's basically what happened. The majority of the army is Japanese and American trained, especially during the Unification Wars here. The artillery, again, is Soviet trained because Soviet artillery doctrine, semi-illiterate troops. Yeah. Here's a list of various small arms. Notable is like the Sturmgewehr, MG42, standard assault rifle, standard general-purpose machine gun, the standard pistol, standard grenade launcher that everyone basically uses. I mean, it's not attached to their rifles or anything, but as a tiny little squad, I mean, it's pretty much like 3-man squads can operate this and do considerable damage with these, because they're like a cross between an actual grenade launcher and a light 81mm mortar. Sure. So this is rather effective, even on the modern battlefield. And I'm just going to touch on this because this is the only indigenous firearm that's going to be on this list, aside from muskets. This is 6-shot, end-block clip, magazine-fed, Mauser bolt-action rifle. There's only long rifles of these. They made no carbines of this. If you're going to get a carbine, it's probably some black powder piece of crap. They just focused on long rifles. Some notable units, 7th Panzer Division. This is probably the first Panzer Division ever created in the Dreislandic military. It's 7th to make it look like there's actually 6 more. There's only 1 Panzer Division anyway. Although the 7th Panzer Division is divided up into multiple regiments that serve across the theater. Apparently 1 division's enough to counter the Imperial Army because the Imperial garrison on the colonies was so small in modern standards. Next we have the 442nd Foreign Legion. This, by the way, this is a reference to the 442nd Regimental Combat Team of US military service, which was an all-Japanese unit during World War II. This is also an all-Japanese unit, except these are all Imperial Japanese veterans. And then some. Next we have 101st Airborne, because you can never have a fictional military with air power without having a airborne unit labeled the 101st. I mean, seriously, if you look at any anime with some kind of airborne unit, there's going to be at least one that's labeled 101st. Wow, the Screaming Eagles are really famous. And then the army actually has its own navy. These are referred to as frigate fleets. These are all made up of Marshal Ney class monitors. By the way, these are actual warships used by the British during World War I. How the hell Actually, it's quite simple. They have blueprints. It's kind of easy to make blueprints, especially if they have material from the Japanese intelligence and such. Now, these are divided into 4 categories: artillery, rocket, anti-air, and escort. Escorts are just basically World War I era destroyers, effectively. Anti-air frigates are basically Marshal Ney class monitors, except without the main gun, They have either a whole bunch of Japanese triple 20s, or Flak 38s, a number of Flak 88s, or even better, anti-aircraft missiles and CIWS. Although the CIWS is really, really crap. It's mostly anti-air missiles. Rocket frigates just have a whole bunch of Katyusha launchers on them. The artillery is just your standard Marshal Ney class monitor. Now the army also has all of these vehicles. There's a lot of these indigenous ones. I'm not really going to go into them, but I'm just going to first go into the stuff that's not indigenous. First we have the Type M4 Model S. This is basically the M4 Sherman Jumbo, M4 A3E2? Yeah, M4 A3E2 with a rifled, long-barreled, high-velocity 105mm gun. And after a while they add shirts into it. Yes. You also have the M3 half-track for troop transport, as well as a whole bunch of captured vehicles from this war, being like the T-72, for example, Type 59, M1A2, T-90. One of the problems this military ends up having is, especially when they fight the Russians, they encounter a number of T-14s. None of their weapons could actually kill a T-14. They could detrack it, they could jam the turret, and they could ECM the entire area of T-14s with like aluminum chaff and such, and jam their targeting systems, but they can't really kill them. Which results in quite a lot of them actually being captured, because panzer divisions always come with APCs with infantry, with pretty good anti-tank weapons that just walk up to the tanks that are detracked and can't do anything and be like, hey, get out of the tank. That's basically how most of the tanks were actually captured, is because of the armored mechanized infantry. Now the indigenous stuff, we have the Type 87, which is basically a main battle tank of, well, obviously it's of Dreislandic Dreislandic origin, sure. But it has design elements of the T-54, specifically the Type 59, T-34-85, Centurion, the Panther, and in fact a captured Japanese Type 74. Now the Type 74 is not used by Dreisland, although there is an etc. here. They don't use the Type 74 in this war, but that Type 74 is heavily influencing the Type 87. Type 98 is basically the same process as this, except it's, well, T-72, M1A2, Type 95, and it ends up turning into a really, really upgraded chieftain. A chieftain that can actually run reliably. Yes. They also use data from Type 87 for that too. Now the Type 87 APC, not to be confused with the main battle tank, is, think of it as a BMP-1, but with the Sherman 105's turret, like the M4A3 Sherman's turret that's got the 105mm howitzer on it. That's basically what this is. And it's also taller so that the crew actually has some comfort. Type 88 SPG is, well, how should I put this? They basically took M4s and put 203mm howitzers on them. That's basically what these are. And then we have the Type 98 SPAG, which is basically a Shilka, as pictured here, except with the Japanese triple 20 instead of 4 23mm cannons. It's 320 mils. Arranged in a row like 1, 2, and 3. As well, now again we have the artillery. There's a lot of indigenous ones. I'm not even going to get into these because it's complicated. And we also have a lot of capture ones. MT-12 Rapira, for example. This is a smoothbore 100mm anti-tank gun, and Dreisland used a lot of these, and they actually copied this under the same designation, which is kind of weird. Dreisland never does that. But again, we now have the Navy. I'm not going to pronounce this anymore, but it stands for Federal Flotilla of Dreisland. It's basically a massive copy-paste of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They use the same exact march, the Gunkan Koshin Kyoku. They basically have the same small as the army, and so on and so forth. They also use these. These are Congo classes. Then this is the Navy Jack. Like I said, very imperial, very reminiscent of Imperial Japanese ships. Now, this is basically an outline of fleets, because unlike the army, you can actually count the number of fleets with your two hands. Yay. First we have the 5 main fleets here. We have the Standing Fleet, which is just, well, a fleet that's just ready to go anywhere. We have the Fortress Islands Garrison Fleet, which is a specialized fleet in defending the north. I'll get into the Fortress Islands a lot later in this series of presentations, but note that this is important. You're going to see a lot of Fortress Island Garrison somethings. We also have the South Dreisland Fleet, obvious where that is. And we also have the Combined Fleet. This is basically the main active fleet. The Combined Fleet's like the main best of the best fleet, while the Standing Fleet's basically just ready to give reinforcements to these guys. And then this is the temporary one here. This is the Northern Expeditionary Fleet. This is for attacking Russian and Imperial positions from the north of the continent. This only appears twice. One for harassing missions and one for harassing missions and the other for the actual invasion of Russian territory. Next we have some Coast Guard fleets. We have the 1st and 2nd Coastal Fleets, which of course are defending the coast. 3rd Coastal Fleet is special in that it's southeast. Then we have the Western Fleet, which is just a whole bunch of The thing about the Western Fleet, it's not really special. It's just out in the west, just basically anti-submarine picket line. And also defends the western portion of South Dreisland. And then we have the Escort Fleet. This is, of course, escorting the Merchant Marine. The Escort Fleet often operates in tandem with the Army's frigate fleets. Except these can't really leave the Icelandic waters. Now, some notable ships include the Nikolai, which is a Imperator Nikolai the First class battleship. Those of you who play World of Warships, this is really annoying. Then we have the Augustus, which is basically a Congo-class fast battleship. They are going to make a lot of Congo-class fast ships, but the Augustus is the main one. You also have the Dreisberg, named after the capital. It's a Yamato class. And no, it does not look like this. This is not the variant of the Yamato I'm referring to, because the Dreisberg has a lot more anti-aircraft guns. Next we have the Alexandria, which is similar to the Japanese Shinano in that it's a Yamato class converted into an aircraft carrier, except the Alexandria actually has its proper planes, instead of the Shinano having outdated stuff because they can't transfer its actual air arm. Next we also have the West Point class, which is a indigenous ballistic missile submarine class. Yes, these are effectively slightly bigger, more modernized Sentoku class submarines, I-400s, I-401, I-402. That, and it's converted to fire ballistic missiles. Most of these are V2s, or modernized V2s, mind you. Next we have the Karl Marx. This is a Russian Kirov-class battlecruiser that has been reverse engineered and simplified. Yeah. The Russians actually were the first ones that actually brought a proper naval force, which means Dreisland just captured the Russian stuff. We also have the Edinburgh class, which is a Shimakaze class destroyer, and the East Point class, which is indigenous aircraft carriers. Basically the Alexandria, except it's built from the ground up as an aircraft carrier. Next, we have the Air Force. This is the Air Force insignia. Insignia? No, this is the Air Force flag. It's more like a pennant, but it's a flag. This basically stands for Federal Air Arm of Dreisland. This doesn't mean Air Force in Dreislandic, it means Air Arm. Luft. air, Waffe, weapon, or arm. Their official march is Unter den Doppeladler, which was introduced by the German faction. But they also like the Aces High march from the movie Battle of Britain, and this is their unofficial march, because, well, by the time this song is introduced, the 21st century factions have already entered the continent and started colonizing. So there's some trade going on, and music records are one of those things that are traded. Yes. Now, among the small arms they have mostly submachine guns and pistols, notably Mauser Schnellfeuer. The Air Force is like the biggest customer for the Schnellfeuer, aside from some of the other special forces units and the tankers. This is eventually replaced by a select fire version of the TT-33, and the need for tankers is also replaced by select fire versions of the TT-33. Now, their main command units are the Homeland Command, which is basically, well, as its name suggests, the military unit that is in charge of defending the homeland. And then we have a subdivision of this unit, which is the South Dreisland Command. South Dreisland seems to be rather privileged in having their own military units. Yes. We also have the Fortress Islands Garrison. Told you this would appear again. We also have the Bundesia Garrison. Remember that country that I briefly mentioned in one of the earlier slides? The Confederation of Bundesia is, again, I'm going to reiterate, the unification of the allied kingdoms from the original show. In exchange for modernization and technology and technical data, Dreisland was basically granted an alliance, or not really an alliance, but basically multiple bases where they could place military emplacements. Most of these are Air Force bases. So basically airstrips, airfields, stuff like that. We also have the Bomber Command, which, as its name suggests, is in charge of bombers. And then finally we have the Philidian Expeditionary Force. Again, Philidia is that subcontinent southwest of Dreisland. This is temporary. This is to help with that War of Succession that I may or may not have explained earlier. Most likely I didn't. But Philadia had a War of Succession. I am sorry. I'm really, really bad at microphoning. And Dreisland's like, hey, we can help. So they send basically a massive expeditionary force made up of planes and send it to the Philidians. At least one faction of it, because it's a War of Succession. It's basically a civil war anyway. Now, most of their fighter aircraft are as shown. As I briefly mentioned beforehand, they did use the J91 Kikka a lot. They used a lot of these. This is their first experience with jet aircraft. They also used the Zero. Type 0 is best 0. And the J7W Shinden. This was for a very long time the principal interceptor aircraft of Homeland Command. They even converted all of these to jet-propelled units. Unfortunately, this particular design wouldn't really last too long as various imported and captured designs started taking priority. Eventually, both the J9Y and Shinden become training aircraft, and the Zero also becomes a training aircraft, but yeah. Next we have the Narodoswerk Type 87. This is an indigenous jet fighter. Effectively, it's equivalent to the MiG-17. Yes, MiG-17. Then we have the Volkswerk Type 90. This is the first supersonic fighter that Dreisland's able to produce. And in aesthetics, it's very similar to the F-104. In terms of flight performance, it's equal to or better than the early MiG-21s. Next we have the Type 98R-1. This is the local MiG-21 copy. Yay. These MiG-21s are the later model MiG-21s that have been upgraded greatly, which means they're in effect superior to the Type 90, and they're also easier to produce than the Type 90 for a lot of reasons. Therefore, this ends up turning into one of the main fighters of Dreisland. Eventually, the Type 90 ends up becoming upgraded enough that they become superior to the MiG-21, but that's a later story. And then we also have the Type 98A-3, again, R for Russia, A for America. This is a copy of the F-16. It's inferior to the F-16, but it's, well, it's a copy of the F-16. I think it's going to do pretty well. Next we have the bombers. J8N1 and B-29s have been in use with Dreisland since its formation. J8N1s aren't really going to last for too long because they end up getting replaced by the B-29s, although the B-29s are mostly supplementing it. But the B-29 eventually gets exported because the Dreisland is able to create the Type 95, sorry. This is basically the strategic bomber that they made based on the B-29. The upgrade to this is the Type 97, which is the intercontinental version of the B-29, and aesthetically it's very much similar to the B-36. This, however, is only used for like a year or two. A year or two? No. 2 years is the length of the Continuation War. This is only used for like half a year. Like in active service, like being used to drop bombs, it's only like half a year before they're actually replaced by the Type B98R-2, which is a copy of the Tupolev Tu-95, shown here. And they also end up getting one of their first jet-powered bombers, in the form of the Type B98C-1. This is a Chinese Xi'an H6 copy. Dreisland has a lot of strategic bombers. And going back to here, the B-29 and the Type 95, these end up going to Filidia and become Filidia's first strategic bombers. Yes. And also going back over here, all these MiG-21s are end up sold to Filidia, but a lot of the stuff that they also sell are a number of Kikas, because they don't really need those Kikas anymore. Yes. Now then, we get to the Marines. Again, this is the Naval Jack. And this is the Corps Marinier. This is where I said that the Indonesian influence is from. This part was based on the Indonesian Corps Marinier. Again, that means Marine Corps. This is part of the Navy, and their march is the Batotai Hoshinkoku, which in effect is the Imperial Japanese Army's march, and also the JGSDF's march, but ignore that. This also happens to be the unit that gets the shortest end of the stick in terms of logistics. They have Naimbu Type 14s. It's a miracle that they aren't really actively issued the Gewehr 85, because they don't really need to. The Marines only really participate as a major fighting force twice. It's the initial invasion of American territory and the invasion of Russian territory. Most of the weapons are the same as the Army, except for, let's say, the MP40, Type 14, as well as captured AK-74s. They're usually expected that they'll end up in situations where they're going to fight an enemy that is armed with something like an AK-74, so they basically just arm them with AK-74s. Of course, these AK-74s are taken away and used by the army later, but we can ignore that. Now, among their units include we have the White Tiger Battalion. Yes. This is a false flag unit. Yeah. Dreisland has no shame when it comes to war. They're even willing to do false flag stuff. These guys, I personally don't know how exactly they managed to do a false flag unit when they're fighting Americans, Chinese, and Russians. especially when they're completely different races. You can just visually look at someone and be like, you're not American. Actually, no, America might be easier, but Chinese and Russians, this is not going to work. So who did they do this on? Well, it's actually the Empire. The antagonists, which I think I said I'll call the Continental Empire. Yes. That's what they used the false flag unit on. Now, the Volunteer Corps is basically this emergency reserve for the Marines. And then we have the Special Attack Force, which at first is basically a suicide attack unit. This gets disbanded because they're like, we don't need to waste all these Marines in suicidal frontal charges. Which is why it's disbanded. Now, of course, you can obviously tell that this was a suicide attack unit because it's labeled the Special Attack Force. This force is also the same name used for kamikaze troops in Imperial Japanese service. Next we get to one of the bigger ones, which is the Tropical Corps. This is the guerrilla unit for jungle conditions. In southwestern areas, there's some strangely tropical countries or islands in places where there should not be tropical areas. Fantasy world geography is weird. And of course we have the Fortress Island garrison. This is everywhere. Most of the vehicles they use are similar to the army, with some exceptions, like the Type 91 LVT, which is effectively an LVT-4, but better. They also are principal users of Imperial Japanese equipment, Type 97, Type 2, and Type 95 respectively. These are all part of the Tropical Corps, because the Tropical Corps has absolutely no value apparently. Although they do have enough value to be armed. Now they also use the standard Imperial Japanese landing craft, which is the Daihatsu class. They also use the number 101 class landing ship and the Shinshu class assault ship. Note these are all Japanese. We also have the Type I-98R-5, which is basically a actual all-out copy of the BMP-1. This, I'm tempted to say, ends up replacing the Type 87 APC later on, but I can't really say that because the Type 87, in terms of firepower, is greater than the BMP-1. Even anti-tank capability, if they strap Panzerfaust to the side of the turret. Next we get to some more minor stuff. This is some of the special forces used. Now we got the Navy has the SNLF and the U-boats. The Army has the airborne cavalry. Basically the Army's heli-borne assault troops that go behind enemy lines and destroy shit. The Marines have the 443rd Foreign Legion. This is the all-American unit. These guys are all Americans. And also happen to be equipped oftentimes with captured American stuff when they are fighting on the front lines. So you'll see a lot of these guys with M16s and M4s. Now the government has their own special forces. This is the Waffenstaats, which is a branch of the Staatstruppen, except this is the military. The Staatstruppen is part of the police. This is basically translated to armed guard, although if you do type in the Japanese word for armed guard, which would be Busou Shin'etai, it would end up translating into Waffen-SS. Ignore that. This is basically the equivalent of like the Navy SEALs and the Delta Force, as they are the unconventional warfare unit of Dreisland. Next we also have the People's Army of Oslavia. Oslavia is another country that gets basically no mention in my story until the Philidian War of Succession. This is basically a massive communist revolutionary military that Dreisland's like, hey, let's put all these communist revolutionaries together, turn them into an army, and make it look like the people of Oslavia are revolting against their great leader. Which is why it's a false flag unit and a proxy military. This is one of the T-3485s used, even though this picture is technically not from this universe. This is from Ukraine, I think. We're heading to the final branches. We now have the Gendarmerie. Yes, the Gendarmerie is a very important military unit in the Dreislandic forces, even though it's mostly provincial militia. Their march is Farewell of Slavianka, which is, again, adopted through Soviet service. Service influence. They use the more outdated stuff. This type M1 rifle, which is basically an M1 Garand and 8mm Mauser. But the main problem here is that this was supposed to be the standard rifle, and then they're like, no, we're using the STG. So they're like, okay, and gave these to the Gendarmerie. Again, you're going to see a lot more outdated stuff here, like the Type 14, as pictured here, as well as the Madsen light machine gun, that bolt-action indigenous thingy, and the MG0815. Still wonder how this is exactly a light machine gun, but anyway. The main units are provincial. We have the North, Southeastern, and West, as well as South Dreislandic. Eventually these end up rolling into one and turn into the National Military Police Force, which effectively is, in Japanese, the Koka Kenpeitai. They often refer to this Japanese designation instead of whatever the Dreislandic equivalent of this is, for reasons unknown. Yes. Their main role is a military police, a national guard, a anti-natural disaster unit, and a riot control unit. We also have some other organizations, and most of this is the civil police, Police. This is made up of provincial and local police, while national policing is done by the Gendarmerie. Their march is, surprisingly, the Internationale. Apparently the police is run by communists, I don't know why. And again, they get the shorter end of the stick that is shorter than the end of the stick that the Marines got. Cause oh my god, that stuff is outdated. Especially the Ruby. Although I think this is actually not that bad of a police pistol. There's also the fact that this is one of the few units that actually use a actual carbine. Type 44. The Airborne uses the M2 carbine, but I consider that an assault rifle, and so does Dreisland. They also use the M1 carbine, but again, they consider that an assault rifle for obvious reasons, because intermediate, it's the M2 select fire, and they just assume that the M1 would basically be supplementing the M2. Anyway, they have various local and provincial branches, South Dreisland branch being the biggest and most well-armed. This is the most militaristic of the civil police. They also have a foreign expeditionary unit. This is mainly for peacekeeping. The military doesn't do peacekeeping, the police does. Which is weird. They're also the special capital branch. Again, their role is law enforcement and peacekeeping. That concludes this particular episode of Headcannon, the history of Dreisland. Next up, we will have the two Wars of Acceptance that I have mentioned earlier. And these two pictures should hopefully give you a general idea of what to expect. Therefore, this is the end of episode 1. I'm Carly Yardy, and you have just listened to Headcannon. Goodbye.